It's a thrill to be here, to have you come out for a presentation. And I thought we'd start with an image when there was a tribe but no staff, a tribe that was terminated, a tribe with no land base, but people with a great sense of identity, love of place, and awareness of history. On the left, Mary Dumont Howren, second, Rose Deardorff Young, and third, Naomi Rainville Gould, fourth, Luella Rondo Michaels, fifth, Charles Jackson, and on the right, Susan Crispin Schaefer. These were a cadre of leaders at a very important time for the Cow Creeks, the time of the land claims case and the effort to secure federal recognition. I thought we'd cover a bit about the early cultural history of Native peoples in southwestern Oregon. They lived in an environment that was clearly shaped by the Pacific Ocean. I encountered that yesterday driving through those rain squalls as I came south from the Willamette Valley. This is a setting that has its weather shaped by that great body of water to the west. It's a temperate climate with small river valleys, particularly those in this region of the Umpqua, Rogue, and Klamath, where streams wend their way through canyons and forests on their way to the sea. The Umpqua is one of those really special watersheds, like the Rogue and Klamath, that cut through the Coast Range of mountains and become very interesting geographical and botanical, biological provinces unto themselves. This is a site at Scottsburg. This is the head of tidewater on the lower Umpqua River. And if we were looking at this location in 1851, there would be a great fish weir made of poles and frames stretching from the left bank to the island to the right bank. This was the important fishery at the head of tidewater on the lower Umpqua River. The Cow Creek home country was far upstream in the place where Cow Creek wends its way through the mountains and its junction with the South Umpqua River. Linda Jackson, tribal member, did this map during the efforts to gain tribal recognition in the 1980s and scattered on the margins some of the traditional resources: acorns, fish, mammals, berries, camas, and the like that were foodstuffs. Housing. Aboriginal housing in southwestern Oregon ranged from a mat-covered lodge to the plank slab lodge over a semi-subterranean pit. Here's a marvelous one from Yurok country near the mouth of Klamath River. It has a cobblestone terrace in front that acts as a passive solar heat collector that captures the heat and then passes it through the earth into the lodge. It has a 3-pitch roof with these great cupped roof planks that work like giant drain tiles to drain the water away that drops into a French drain that surrounds the structure filled with stones. On the seacoast, sometimes that French drain was lined with whale vertebrae, something to create some space and drainage area to get the moisture away from the lodge. The interiors of these structures were open, sometimes with sleeping compartments around the wall. There were no chimneys. The smoke rose from a hearth out through the roof planks above, which made a dandy place for a rack for smoking fish or elk or deer meat. The floor was covered with cattail fiber mats. These were multi-family dwellings. Often several generations might share the same dwelling place. This is an actual a photograph I took in 1971 of the interior of one of these old lodges on the lower Klamath River, and you can see the mottled appearance of the roof beams where the hand adze had chopped away to shape the cedar board. A secondary structure in the village was the sweat lodge. This was dug deep in the earth, lined with stone, covered with planks, covered over with earth. It was an important place for curing, ritual, and preparing for good luck in hunting by purging the body of odors. Both men and women sweated. This is more typically a men's sweat lodge. The women often sweated by using fiber mats or deer hides over a pole frame, and the steam was produced by passing in heated rocks using elk horn or deer horn tongs to move the hot rocks to the sauna, where water would be sprinkled to produce the steam. Tools included the D-shaped adze. The blades were often made of schist or local stone. Hammer stones, such as those in the display case, or these were used for pounding poles and building fish weirs. Cedar, where available, was a very important resource because it yielded bark for making a quick berry basket. Just a few folds of cedar bark and some lacing could create a water bucket or berry basket. It had root for cordage, and it also produced the big planks for making canoes or framing structures. Traditional foodstuffs. Very popular in the Umpqua region was the camas lily. I thought yesterday when I drove through Camas Swale, also known as Wilbur, which is mostly an industrially developed area today with a trailer factory and a boat works and a pole yard, that area was once a fabulous camas meadow where native people would go in the spring of the year to harvest the bulb of the blue camas. There's also a white death camas that is deadly poisonous. This is camassia, that is the important foodstuff. That bulb, when cooked in a rock-lined oven in the ground, will become very delicious, sweet, and can be stored for several months. It was removed from the ground with a digging stick with handle that was thrust in, and with a jerk with the hands, the bulb would pop out of the ground. Other food resources included salmon berries, blackberries, usually at midsummer, and in the fall, huckleberries. And the ripening of the huckleberries usually coincided with the beginning of the fall deer hunting season. So for the Cow Creeks and their neighbors, food quest produced a seasonal round. In the wintertime, people lived in villages along the river, South Umpqua or Cow Creek. In the spring of the year, they might move up to the camas meadows. By late summer, they would be up at the huckleberry patches on the Rogue Umpqua Divide to pick huckleberries and to hunt. And then with the coming of fall weather, such as we're experiencing today, and the chill of the day and the night, they would go back to the lower elevations. Large game hunting involves some ingenuity, such as a deadfall trap for taking bear, or pits dug in the earth to take elk. And an elk would come bounding along the trail, jump over a log, and would be impaled on a skewer that was placed in a pit on the other side of the log. Fishing was an important activity throughout this watershed. Fish spears, fish nets, and fish traps were all employed. There is also a very interesting description in George Riddle's book on the history of the Riddle Valley about eel fishing by the Cow Creeks, where the young boys or men would dive into the creek, grab an eel and wrest it loose from where it was fastened on a rock, because they fastened on with a sucker, and bite it behind the neck to kill it and throw it up on the bank. This is a smoked dried eel. I tried eating it right after photographing it. It was like eating the tongue of a hiking boot. Eel were also taken in eel pots. This is a woven wicker trap for catching eel. The lamprey is anadromous like salmon and steelhead. It migrates in from the sea and was once an important food resource throughout western Oregon. basketry was a well-developed art for Native women. They started learning the skills of basket making as a child and became adept at both gathering the material as well as weaving. The materials included shredded bark of the hazel tree, the black stem of a maidenhair fern, white beargrass collected at higher elevations, or for decorative element, even the overweave of porcupine quills. Basket making or handiwork also involved the harvest of cattails or tules and the drying and sewing them with a needle, and they were sewed along a crease. The mats or the cattails were pressured with a, oops, I didn't have my mat creaser there, with a mat creaser and then sewn together. If they were puckered and you sewed on the pucker, they were less likely to split or shatter. Wealth items included obsidian blades, and I believe there are some on display in the office area across the way. These were large wealth blades, maybe 14, 15 inches long, and they were held during the wealth display dance, and their only function was to say, look how rich I am. I've been able to trade from Central Oregon and get this valuable obsidian. Look how rich I am. I have this marvelous blade. Quite a number of these were excavated in what is called the Gold Hill site. It's on the north bank of Rogue River, just below Table Rock in Jackson County. I've also seen these blades, wealth blades at Coos Bay. So they had a popular use from Coos Bay south to the Klamath and up through the upper Klamath, Rogue, and Umpqua valleys. Another important wealth item was the scalp of the pileated woodpecker. These birds like to live in the decaying tops of old fir trees. That's where they nest. They are rarer today because of the logging out of old-growth forests. They were avidly hunted by Native American males. And here, John Bradford's headdress is actually bright red pileated woodpecker feathers, and he's holding two wealth display blades. This photograph was taken at Silet's Reservation, subsequent to 1875. Or here's an example of how a woman might display her wealth. Her basket hat has this marvelous woodpecker scalp, as well as dentalium shells, a marine mollusk traded south from British Columbia to Western Oregon. Dentalium shells also were commerce that were traded through the Dalles at Salado Falls to the Nez Perce and out onto the northern plains. So here is a bank account, your time certificate, an investment account in dentalium shells. A dozen shells measuring from wrist to shoulder was a good count, and if a man had several of these, he might make a down payment on wife number 2 or wife number 3. So popular were these that in 1853, the linguist and secretary to the Willamette Valley and California Treaty Commissions, a man named George Gibbs, was mining on the Klamath River at Orleans Bar and had a family trading house in Macau, and commissioned his brother Frank to have the Chinese make counterfeit dentalium shells in porcelain that Frank shipped to Astoria, Oregon, and then they came by mule team to the Klamath River, and Gibbs paid Yurok and Hoopa laborers in counterfeit dentalium shells for working his placer diggings on the Klamath River. I've often wondered if any of these historic collected shells that are at the museum at Wairika, for example, might include the Chinese counterfeit ones that Gibbs imported in the 1850s. So here would be a very nice necklace of dentalium shells, and single shells were stored in an antler purse. And there would be then a buckskin wrap that would close the purse. And if you were going to a stick game or a gambling game, you would clutch the purse and take those shells and then bet on the outcome of the shake of the sticks or whatever the game might be, and then pay up as you do at Seven Feathers. In terms of worldview, there was a coming to terms with nature. This involved a spirit quest at puberty. It was obligatory for all boys, and many girls also went on this spirit quest. It would be a matter of going to a lonely bend in the river or a high mountain ridge, communing with nature, fasting, dreaming, dancing, and praying, and waiting for the spirit world to speak. So these rituals might prepare a person to find their guardian spirit or helper that would be their companion throughout life. If this was a particularly powerful experience, a person could go back and gain additional spirit helpers. And here's a shaman who is fully wrapped up in this spiritual world, having obtained several spiritual helpers. And then if you needed some assistance in getting over bronchitis, you would pay the shaman to come and blow on your body or dance or give you some concoction to take. Not too unlike modern medicine, I suppose. No, there's a lot of faith healing involved in these traditional practices. Well, change came to this Native American world in the late 18th century when mariners began plying the North Pacific, exploring what was one of the great unknown areas to Europeans, namely the west coast of North America and the east coast of Asia. The maritime fur trade of the late 18th century led in 1811 to John Jacob Astor of New York City investing in the Pacific Fur Company and establishing an outpost, Astoria, at the mouth of the Columbia River. The first expeditions to the Umpqua region began in the 18-teens with these land-based fur trappers. They many of these men had found employ in the fur trade in Hudson's Bay, the boundary waters of the Great Lakes region, then the Rocky Mountains, and finally in the far Pacific Northwest. Astor's partners sold out in 1814 to the Northwest Company of Eastern Canada, and in 1821 the Northwest Company merged with the Hudson's Bay Company, which in 1825 built Fort Vancouver on the right. There's the complex at Fort Vancouver, and that was the depot of import and export of trade commodities in the Pacific Northwest till 1846. In 1849, the United States Army arrived, and up here on this terrace, we see Fort Vancouver, where Officers' Row still stands at that same location with buildings from the 1850s. Down here on the right is part of the Kanaka village. The Hudson's Bay Company brought in over 100 South Sea Islanders from Hawaii to Polynesia to work for the company. And right in here is the Catholic chapel, because in 1839 Catholic missionaries arrived from Quebec because of the presence of a Catholic French-Canadian fur trapping population. Well, there were a number of employees of the Hudson's Bay Company who came to the Umpqua region. Many of these were men of part French-Canadian, Native American heritage. Their Native American background included Assiniboine, Cree, Chippewa, Iroquois, and then they found native wives in Western Oregon. Charles Rondeau, Jean-Baptiste de Porte-Mackay, Charles Groslouis, Alexander Dumont, whose name was also Garrett, Francois Archambault, Joseph Lavador, Pierre Perisseau, pronounced Parzou nowadays, but it was a very notable French name, Perisseau, in the 18th century, Paul Guilbeault, Peter Lachance, and there were others, Rainville and other employees of this company who came to this region. Well, also coming to this region were American pioneers. And there was a stirring in the United States in the 1840s, captured here in this allegorical painting, Manifest Destiny, Charles Gass painting that shows manifest destiny, a flaxen-haired, well-endowed young white woman carrying a Bible and telegraph wire in her right arm, headed west, as are the pioneers in their covered wagons, and civilization in the background, locomotives and smog in cities in the east. Gass did a pretty good job of capturing the expansionist spirit of the Jackson and Polk administrations of the 1830s and the 1840s. That stirring led in 1843 to the outfitting of a wagon train of over 900 immigrants, 3,000 head of livestock that headed over the Oregon Trail to the Willamette Valley. That was the first big wave of Euro-Americans coming in the footsteps of the fur trappers and missionaries who had been in the Oregon country earlier. They came with determination and the hope of getting free land. Conditions in the Mississippi and Missouri Valley were difficult after 1837. Andrew Jackson had withdrawn the deposits of the federal government from the Bank of the United States. He killed Bank number 2 and brought about the Panic of 1837. For the next 7 years, many Americans were unable to sell their farms and pay their debts. But with the prospect of free land in the Oregon country, as Lewis Lynn and Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri promised might be the case, they were willing to abandon their farms and take their grub stake and outfit a wagon or 2 wagons and take their livestock and move to Oregon. Well, Lynn and Benton counties in the Willamette Valley are named for those 2 senators who in 1850 secured passage of the Oregon Donation Land Act. And the pioneers who came had their designs on wonderful places like the Umpqua Valley. By 1849, the Applegate brothers and Levi Scott had moved south from their initial claims in Polk County to the Yoncalla, Scott Valley area of northern Douglas County. By 1850, the Main Valley, which had been wholly a Native American land occupied by the Yoncalla, Umpqua, Calapooya, Cow Creeks, and southern Molalla, was now subjected to pioneer settlement. They found fertile soil, fine oak groves for splitting out fencing material for their split rail fences. These photos, by the way, are from the 1870s, taken by the photographer, geologist Joseph Silas Diller, who did a lot of geological work in the Umpqua Valley. And they carved out homesteads. First donation claims, and then after 1862, homesteads under the Homestead Act. Here we see a pioneer settlement with the outbuildings, all made of log. This is before the advent of sawmills and the planting of an orchard. There was another factor beyond land that drew Euro-Americans to the West, and that was the discovery of gold on the American fork of the Sacramento River in January of 1848. By 1849, 100,000 gold seekers rushed to California. And some of those soon moved north. They came to the diggings on the Trinity River, the Klamath, and by 1851 to the Rug River Valley. Their designs on the landscape were exploitive. They overturned the gravel bars. They were in quest of placer gold deposits that is down in the crevices and potholes next to the bedrock. And the target sites were those well-drained riverine terraces where native peoples had their villages. So there was immediate dislocation by gold miners of native people, plus the befouling of the rivers with silt and other runoff that had huge impact on the fish runs. Here we see a riffle box and set up with pans and buckets for the moving of huge amounts of earth and washing for gold in a placer mine. The miners were unemployed by midsummer. It's necessary to have water to wash for gold. By July and August, the South Umpqua, Cow Creek, Upper Rogue, Klamath region dried up. Without water, the miners had no employment. But they decided to form volunteer companies and make war on the Indians and then build a federal government for their services. And they did so. The Rogue River Indian War of 1853 resulted in nearly $150,000 of charges sent to Congress to fund the war that the volunteers had fought. And the result was calamitous for the Native people. In 1853, the Oregon legislature prohibited the sale of firearms or ammunition to Native Americans. They had to try to fight back with bow and arrow. The consequences were a series of wars between 1852 and 1856. And of a Native American population of more than 10,000 in 1852, only about 2,000 survived in 1856. So there was a horrific impact on the demography or population of the Native peoples of the southwestern corner of this state. Belatedly, the federal government entered a treaty program. It passed the Donation Act in 1850, but didn't get about negotiation of ratified treaties until 1853. Consequently, there was wholesale trespass on Native American lands without any effort to clear the title. In 1853, the third superintendent, Joel Palmer, a man of conscience and tenacity, embarked upon the first successful treaty program in the state, or the territory. He came south in 1853 and negotiated a treaty with the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua, went on to the valley to do one with the Rogue River people, eventually came back and did a second one with the Shasta Skoton in the Rogue Valley, and ultimately negotiated 9 ratified treaties in Oregon Territory. The Cow Creek Cession is number 313, an area that involves Cow Creek and the South Umpqua River to an arbitrary line. Session 401 is the Southern Molalla Treaty that Palmer negotiated in 1854. Session 312 in the Rogue Valley at Takelma Treaty is from 1853. This is the Shasta, Skoton, and Grave Creek Treaty in Josephine County. And then Treaty number 397 was never ratified. So there is no legal taking of land along the entire coast of Oregon, but a series of ratified treaties here and also up in the Willamette Valley, the Willamette Valley Treaty being negotiated in 1855. Treaty provisions. The treaty is very important. It's a formal government-to-government relationship between an Indian tribe and the United States. So it has legal consequence to the present day. It's highest law of the land. Under the Constitution, it's approved by the United States Senate and signed by the President. The Cow Creek ceded approximately 700,000 acres of land for $12,000, or that came down to about 2 1/3 cents per acre. That was unconscionable because Congress had fixed the price of land in Oregon Territory in 1850 at $1.25 per acre. So why was Indian land worth only 2 1/3 cents per acre? That's a question that the Cow Creeks began to ask in the 20th century. $1,000 in goods, a distribution of shoes, socks, shirts, pants, cloth, needles, pins, and flags as part of the treaty agreement. There would be an additional $11,000 in annuity payments over 20 years. There was to be the creation of a temporary reservation on Council Creek. That's on the south or east side of Lower Cow Creek near Riddle, and construction of 2 houses for headmen at $200 each, cheap houses for 2 of the tribal leaders. That treaty was ratified in 1855. In the 1850s, there was, of course, significant Euro-American incursion into Western Oregon. In the state, by 1855, there were 9,200 donation land claims filed on over 2 million acres of Native American lands before the ratification of any treaty. Early settlers included Josiah Knott and Jackson Reynolds, who established a tavern, hotel, and hospitality services at a place called Canyonville. Makes good sense. People traveling between Oregon and California might need a meal or a place to stay or fuel for their livestock. All right. So Canyonville came on early. There was also development in the valley with the advent of new technologies such as steam threshers and harvesters and an expansion of mining. This, for example, is the Nonpareil quicksilver mine, one of several that extended in the Western Cascades from London on the coast fork of the Willamette River right down to the Rogue-Umpqua Divide. It looks very homemade, doesn't it? And here's the water wheel down here and the mill buildings. These sites, by the way, remain a potential environmental hazard because they were going after mercury. And when I've been out to Bonanza and Elkhead here in Douglas County, those tailings are still there. They're untreated, uncovered, exposed. They're washing into the watershed. Fisheries concern, Mr. Crispin. All right. Development also included new towns. And here's an early view of development of the hotel at Riddle. Again, hospitality services for travelers coming through the Cow Creek Valley, which was developed with the railroad going through the Rogue Valley in 1884. And others going after game. Native people had a real challenge to survive because the fish, the deer, the elk were hunted by the new settlers. The cattle grazed and ate off the camas lilies. The hogs ate the acorns that had to be processed for the extraction of tannic acid before they were palatable. The native peoples who remained in this region faced a lot of competition and challenge from the new settlers. That's the Riddle Concert Band, by the way. So, there were also federal programs that came, and they included the establishment of Native American boarding schools. The first established at Forest Grove in 1869. Eventually this became the Indian Training School at Chemawa, which today is the nation's oldest Native American boarding school. The oldest one that still is operating. Here's a before picture of the children arriving at Chemawa. They're looking fairly traditional in terms of their haircuts, though they're wearing Euro-American clothing. And here they are a few days later as they're beginning the process of cultural transformation. This was an English-only program taught mostly by missionary teachers, and with manual labor training skills. Carpentry, wagon making, sewing, cooking, beadwork, these were the curriculum. It was not anticipated that Native Americans would become teachers, physicians, lawyers, accountants. It was just basic skills courses at these schools in the curriculum for almost 80 years. There were some interesting moments, though. Edward St. Pierre, born in 1884, had an encounter with Cow Creek history, language, and culture. He was one of several brilliant graduate students in anthropology at Columbia University who studied with Franz Boas, who trained a generation of linguists, anthropologists. And as a 25-year-old, St. Pierre published in 1909 the volume Takelma Texts. He had come to Oregon and worked with Gwish Gawashan, or Frances Johnson, as she was known, a Takelma speaker from the Rogue Valley who lived at Siletz Reservation. St. Pierre had a good ear for linguistics and phonology. He could write in phonetic code the words and accents of the Takelma language and produced interlinear text. So we see it in Takelma and then in English below. And this is part of a tale that involves Dal Dal, right over here. Dal Dal is the dragonfly and is one of the creative forces in nature, putting the land in order and the people onto the landscape. And in this case, Gawashan Princess was dictating the story of Dal. There was another important recording of information about the Cow Creek people of southwestern Oregon. George W. Riddle arrived overland by wagon train with his parents in 1851, coming by way of the Applegate Trail. In 1920, he published a series of articles in the Riddle Enterprise, and these were collected, and I happen to have an autographed copy of Early Days in Oregon by George Riddle, and in there he recounted in considerable detail the Miwalita, Wartahu, Targunsa, Myrtle Creek bands of the neighboring Cow Creek tribe, their use of fisheries, their use of iris fibers to make snares to catch deer by their hooves. Just fascinating information relating to the culture of the Cow Creek ancestors. Thomas D. Cutsforth grew up in Riddle, graduated from the University of Oregon in 1916, and in 1928 published Hunting Superstitions in the Cow Creek region of southern Oregon, an interesting account that relates to the Cow Creeks and to Tutney of the Rogue River watershed and some of the taboos and practices of hunting yet observed in the 19-teens and 20s when he was growing up in Riddle, Oregon. Notice he also references the Hudson's Bay Company as a source because the French-Canadian Métis who married local native women were part of that legacy of hunting and having certain taboos or acts that are recounted. Now, there was another side to the perceptions of Native Americans in the early 20th century as well. And this is reflected in Clark, Down and Blue's A History of Oregon. This was a textbook that I encountered as an elementary student going to school in Coos Bay. Robert C. Clark was the chairman of the Department of History at the University of Oregon. He wrote, "The Oregon Indians were true savages. The Indians of the Oregon country represented various stages of savage and barbarian culture, but it cannot be said that any of them possessed even the rude beginnings of civilization. They had neither a written language nor a settled agriculture. It can hardly be said they tilled the soil," and so on. Well, that's a rather narrow view of what it is to be civilized, because the Cow Creeks had a way to survive, a seasonal round, and accommodation with nature, an interface with their neighbors through diplomacy, trade, and commerce. They had an expansive oral literary tradition with would-be poems and novels and short stories, part of which were recorded by Edward Sapir. But all that was lost or unknown to Professor Clark. It was in these dark moments of that kind of book going into Oregon schools that the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua decided to mount an effort to sue for the fair value of the treaty cession lands in the South Umpqua region. Between 1928 and 1935, between 1922 and 1933, the tribe had 5 land claims bills introduced in Congress. It was a mighty effort for a small group living in Tiller, Grew, Canyonville, Roseburg to get a congressman to introduce special legislation. But the tribe had good friends. Jessie Vinson Rapp, who lived in Roseburg, helped type the letters. She worked with Sue Schaefer's mother, Nellie Furlong Crispin, who was the tribal secretary, to engage in that correspondence. They worked with Representative Seneca Fouts, who I think by his name must have probably been part Native American, and with Senator Charles McNary to get those bills introduced. The 5th time the bill for the land claims case passed the House and the Senate, but was vetoed by President Hoover. He said, "We can't afford this kind of litigation that would have a claim against the government in the midst of a Great Depression." Well, the reason that the legislation was necessary is that the United States prohibited Indian tribes from suing the country or the U.S. in 1868. There was an invocation of sovereign immunity. So the only way the tribe could proceed with the lawsuit was to get a special jurisdictional act, and when it succeeded, it was vetoed by Hoover. The same moments that these events were occurring in the East, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was developing its annual Indian census rolls. This is the roll for April 1, 1932, and we see Lewis and Clara Thomason. They're enumerated as one-half Native American tribe Umpqua. I hope Mrs. Kittleman is aware of these records. Okay, here's another census from South Umpqua, April 1, 1933. Tom Rando, Clementine. He's one half, she's one quarter. Tribe Umpqua, and so on. There are some folks who deny the identity of the Cow Creeks, but the federal records show a different story. These are the annual census enumerations done by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Well, in modern times, which for me are nearly 40 years ago in terms of Cow Creek, there was a group that I knew that was meeting regularly, mostly at the Veterans Memorial Hall in Myrtle Creek, and they included a number of tribal elders. In fact, here's Wallace Rondo right here in the center, and others you may recognize. And I had, in the 1970s, just written some books. In 1971, I had done Requiem for a People, the Rogue Indians and the Frontiersmen. And then I boldly did a 6-part television series for CBS and OPB called The Indians of Western Oregon, This Land Was Theirs. That came with another book in 1977. And all of a sudden, there was Sue Schaefer and a delegation knocking at my door in Lake Oswego saying, "Could you help us? Here's our predicament. We're terminated as a tribe. We believe we have a valid land claims argument. We need help." Well, in 1978, when they knocked on my door, I was expert witness in the Columbia River fishing rights litigation, part of U.S. versus Washington, and the young attorney I was working with was from Washington, D.C. His name was Dennis J. Whittlesey. And so I said to Dennis, there are some Indian people in southwestern Oregon who could really use our help. Would you be willing to go down to Myrtle Creek, Oregon, to meet with these people? Well, I didn't know at the time that Dennis's wife, Judy, is Choctaw. Their 2 children are enrolled in the Choctaw tribe. Judy is the descendant of Pushmataha and Peter Pinchlin, both notable Choctaw chiefs, and that he was more than interested in helping an Oregon Indian tribe. Now here's Dennis in his redneck phase. He was a young attorney when we got together, and he's actually wearing a pistol here. All right. Yeah, some of you who know him, he has white, snowy white hair, and he's more of a city boy nowadays. Anyway, our target was a land claims litigation. And what the Cow Creeks needed was to secure a jurisdictional act. The tribe got a bill introduced in 1979, but then it had to be lobbied through Congress. And here we are, June 14, 1979. Washington, D.C. can be pretty miserable in the summertime. Humid, crowded, busy, and then by August, Congress goes on vacation, and you're lucky to find any congressional staffers there. But the Cow Creeks raised enough money to be able to put a delegation together to go to Washington, D.C., to work with Dennis and members of Congress to get a jurisdictional act passed. It became very evident to me early on that the attorney the tribe was working with from Klamath Falls was in way over his head, and fortunately he stepped aside and things started to move. The tribe also forged very important relationships with other groups in the county. So here's John Young, Amaryllis, Janie Husner in the background, and we are listening to Charlie Collins, a wonderful employee of the Tiller Ranger District from the 19-teens, at a Forest Service picnic, recounting work and trouble with the Cow Creeks, namely Bob Thomason setting forest fires to burn the countryside so he could get better browse for deer and elk, but also get hired by the Forest Service to have a job anyway. Here's Mary Howland, Luella Michaels, Theora, and Gans Rondo at one of those gatherings. And here in the shrubbery where he belongs, Charles Jackson, okay? Charles lives at the end of nowhere, somewhere up in Elk Creek, right? You go to Tiller and then you keep going, and you look for a big stack of debris, and there's Charles, all right? I'm being tough on Charles, but he was Mr. Chairman when I became involved with the tribe, and I got to know Charles very well. And he saw to it that if I was going to work as the tribe's expert witness, that I stepped into these places. So we went to the Huckleberry Patch up on the Rogue Umpqua Divide. We went to a spiritual place called Old Tom's Prairie, also in the high country above the Rogue and Umpqua Divide. We were at South Umpqua Falls. We visited the medicine trees on Jackson Creek, another primal location. And then there were activities like the powwows. Here's Frances Rondo Corder and her husband at one of the powwows at South Umpqua Falls in the early 1980s. As the land claims case was proceeding, Dennis said, well, why don't we go ahead and overturn termination? I mean, he was a no-holds-barred attorney. So Jim Weaver and Mark Hatfield provided the leadership for the introduction of legislation to overturn termination. It came about because of strong community support from pioneer families and the South Umpqua Historical Society. The tribe had no resources, but there was money provided by the American Friends Service Committee, Jesuit Ministries, and the National Indian Lutheran Board. And they also gave me a place to sleep when I was in Washington, D.C. I paid $15 a night, took my sleeping bag, and slept on a cot on a sleeping porch in February in Washington, D.C. At Davis House or Quaker House. They had two facilities where I could bunk at very modest cost while we were in D.C. lobbying and doing research. Back home in the valley, here South Umpqua Valley, here's Rose Deerdorf and Tudor, a little younger and thinner, right? And Nip Davis and Shirley Roan, I think, here, right? And her sister. Look at all that hair, okay? Amaryllis and two of her daughters. Amaryllis was Sergeant at Arms, and that was memorable. She would come to the meetings, and you see she could become pretty tough if she wanted to, and she had a big metal spoon that she would wear through her belt like this. And if somebody got disorderly, she'd take that spoon out and sort of look around the room. I found Amaryllis fascinating. And she had, 11 or 12 children, and she named the last one Amaryllis Jr., which I thought was great. Anyway, so they range from Mary to Amaryllis. She also made very good fry bread, and usually ran the fry bread booth at Pioneer Days in Canyonville. Changing times. The federal recognition brought about a very slow flow of federal funds. So in 1984, the tribe hired Dr. Catherine Stiano, an anthropologist from Kansas, as a tribal manager. It's negotiated a settlement for the land claims case for $1.5 million. A very important legacy from the past. And Catherine helped find the money with a very modest federal grant to start it to purchase a flea bag motel called the Evergreen, run by Mrs. Isabel Grunst on the north end of Canyonville. It had a failed septic system. It had about 10 derelict trailers and about 6 motel units that I wouldn't sleep in or walk in, but it was a land base. And in 1984-85, the tribe launched a formal enrollment documentation project. Now, during the enrollment prior to federal recognition, there was an open enrollment period, and all tribal members were encouraged to enroll and get their families to enroll. Robert Bushman, however, refused to enroll. He said, "No one can tell me whether or not I'm a Cow Creek. I'm not going to participate. I know who I am." Well, Congress didn't. And when Congress approved the roll at federal restoration, Bushman and his family were not listed. As a matter of federal law, they were not tribal members. So Bushman was very angry, and he sued the entire tribal council and Professor Beckham and Attorney Whittlesey, and hauled us into a miserable week in the courtroom in Eugene. We countersued because he had libeled us repeatedly in the press for $2.4 million. We won. I'm still waiting because there was no money forthcoming. And I'll take a moment and tell what happened. During the trial, the Bushman trial, there was a bomb threat made on the federal courthouse. And the threat was Attorney Whittlesey will never leave the courtroom alive, the courthouse alive. So quite unusual for 1986. They put in a metal detector and had security guards before you could enter the court chambers. Bushman was in poor health. He'd done some bad things to his body and was on oxygen. So he had to leave his oxygen tank out in the hall, but he had these tubes that ran through the doors and over to where he was seated. Judge Hogan came to a recess in the morning, and he left, and we all stood up, and pretty soon I looked over, and there's Bushman. He was just gasping for breath, and Tom Rondo yelled across the courtroom to me, "Beckham, don't move." I was standing on the oxygen tubes. Nearly killed the plaintiff in the federal courthouse. That was a miserable moment. And there were others, like when the Portland area office cut off funding to the tribe, or when the Bureau refused to approve the tribe's decision to vest the judgment fund in an endowment account and only operate off the interest. But positive things happened. In 1986, the tribe secured trust status for the Evergreen Tract. This is of singular importance because it predated the National Indian Gaming Act by 2 years. Sue Schaefer and I walked the halls of the Interior Department hour after hour. It took 23 months to get the Evergreen Tract into trust status. But it was only that determined push by then Tribal Chair Sue that made that happen. And it was critical because when IGRA was passed in 1988, the Cow Creeks had a trust land base available for gaming. Interestingly, neither Celeste nor Grand Ronde had that. And they had to get special legislation for Chinook Winds and Spirit Mountain, which were outside their trust land base after 1988. And then in 1987, Congress passed the Distribution Fund Act, a third law lobbied by this tribe through Congress. This was what created the endowment fund, where the $1.5 million is still there, kicking out interest for tribal development activity. Well, the Evergreen Tract was this little piece of land in North Canyonville. There's the motel, the trader place, and the grove of oak and fir trees behind. Now, parking lot, warehouses, clinic, and so on, but it was pretty modest. So what's going to happen to the Evergreen Tract? In 1986, we had a strategy meeting in Portland, and that horrible stuff in the background is my son's half pipe, for he was a skateboarder, okay? And there's his tree fort, and all again. Sherry Schaefer, Dennis Whittlesey, Sue, our friend Helen Sanders from Chehalis Reservation, very important advisor, former National Secretary of the National Council of the American Indians, a close friend of Dennis's and mine, and constant inspiration on Indian affairs, now 87 years old, George Schaefer, my sister-in-law Cynthia, and Beckham's little brother Mark, who went to Harvard Business School and MIT. So, with the interest off the endowment fund, the Cow Creeks were brave enough to trust the Beckhams one more time. And the Beckham brothers and sister-in-law did a business plan to look at the prospects of a bingo hall blackjack facility on the Evergreen property. It looked like it could be a winner on bingo and blackjack. So that was sort of the get-go. And among the things we found, for example, when we did the traffic volume study, is that within 2 hours' drive of Canyonville, Oregon, were 890,000 people, which means even though it looks a bit rural, there's a prospect of having a viable gaming operation. Grand Ronds were able to get Class 3 gaming with table games like roulette. Cow Creek was immediately eligible to do that because of this clause in the original compact. It opened now the prospect in 1992 for more than bingo, the prospect for gaming, and at that moment the tribe chartered the Umpqua Indian Development Corporation with 5 tribal members and 4 non-tribal members. Rondone was one of those, Terry Swaggerty, former Commissioner Bill Vian, and a history teacher from Portland, Oregon. And it was our assignment to try to get things going now for real development of the Evergreen property, forging business partnerships and making things happen. For a whole year, the tribe attempted to secure a loan. Sue and I went to every commercial bank, Wells Fargo, U.S. Bank, Umpqua Bank. We went to the savings and loans, including Old Equitable Savings and Loan. No one would lend money. So we went back to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and were able to get a $835,000 loan from the BIA with a 13-year payback. But we needed a partner. No commercial bank or savings and loan would stand up and match the federal loan. Again, utter frustrations, even with a 90% federal guarantee on the matching money. So in the meantime, my youngest brother, Mark, had done some work with Bass Group that makes ale in England, and they own off-course betting parlors. And they had a division called British American Bingo with an operation at Muckleshoot and Isleta Puebla. And Mark persuaded their North American chief operating officer, John O'Neill, to fly to Eugene, Oregon. I picked up John at the Eugene airport and headed south. And the farther we got, the wilder it looked, and the more rural it became. And we got to Canyonville, and I said, there are 890,000 people within 2 hours' drive of this location. This is the primary West Coast corridor between Canada and Mexico. We are convinced that gaming will work at this site, and we need British American Bingo to buy into this operation. And they did. They did. So we recruited British American Bingo. Umpqua UDIC went to work and built a metal shed, and there was a gravel parking lot. And it took a lot of creativity. And Bill Vian was one of those who really helped. The tribe did not have enough money to put in a water tank to meet the fire insurance code to have water on site in case of fire. Vian had a great idea. He said, look at that low space along the access road. Let's put those inflatable rubber bumpers that are used to haul glue for plywood in there and fill them up with water. So there were 4 of these big rubber reservoirs placed in that low spot and covered over with dirt and gravel. That became the water tank to meet the insurance requirements for the new gaming facility. A metal shed with a gravel parking lot. And it's somewhere back in that complex behind the kitchens, I think somewhere, maybe used for storage today, but the complex has grown and grown. So out of that, of course, has become the Seven Feathers operation, with the Truck and Travel Center, the Jordan Creek Development, the Power Company, the K-Bar ranches, the administrative offices here in Roseburg, the clinics and health care, educational assistance, jobs for over 1,100 people in Douglas County, and it has left an interesting legacy. Cow Creeks are a tribe investing in people, health, education, housing, jobs. Cow Creeks have persisted in spite of rejection, overwhelming adversity, and termination from 1956 to 82. Cow Creeks have worked at being good neighbors. Cow Creeks are a tribe that has written its history by hard work and perseverance. Thank you.